Thanks very much, everybody, for joining for another fantastic webinar opportunity here. We're very, very excited as a part of our workshop series to be able to bring Chad Workman from the University of Louisville to the conversation today. And we're very grateful for the amount of work that not only he's put into the presentation, but to the University of Louisville to provide this opportunity to us and certainly to Catapult, and on behalf of the University of Louisville. Please pass on those sentiments as well, Chad. Yeah, we're really keen to provide a conversation here today that's based around the collegiate level, obviously field hockey, and really from a practitioner's standpoint, what the evolution of that coaching experience and the physical component really does look like in the real world. And certainly there's none better in the game than Chad, and we're really excited to be able to bring this to the industry today. So I'll just move through the slides here. So just, yeah, a little bit about myself. Matthew Pell, one of the applied sports scientists here at Catapult, working with the University of Louisville as a part of my account management and across Major League Soccer and also American football. And as a part of the relationship, as I mentioned, we've got a really great relationship with the University of Louisville, and we're very grateful for the opportunity for the practitioners that have been brought to us today. Just a little bit on the company and who we are. We are not only a really big wearable company with over 3,500 clients across the globe in a multitude of sports. We also have a video product in SBG and more to be able to bring to the industry, and we're really grateful to be able to work with all of our clients across the globe. And if you do have any information that you would like to tap into, please feel free to reach out directly on the website. And certainly hit up any aspect of sales, and we're happy to facilitate those conversations. Our vision here at Catapult is to, as we can see, unleash the potential of every athlete and team on the earth. And we certainly recognise that that's a core value of ours, and we are continuing to strive to do that with multiple solutions as a part of our product roadmap. But as I mentioned today, we are very excited to have Chad Workman. I'm not going to introduce him too much, but he certainly comes to us with a great deal of experience in the industry and a lot of success as well. And Chad, I think I'll hand it over to you to just explain probably a little bit as to how this conversation did start as well between yourself and I, because I think that's really important for the industry to be aware of as well. But again, mate, welcome. And yeah, we're really excited to have you here. And if anyone does have any questions, I'll just leave this slide up as well. Feel free to scan the QR code and drop any questions in. We will certainly endeavour to get back to you with regards to. Chad will have his email on his presentation as well. And that's certainly something we want to facilitate in terms of how we're growing the industry. But Chad, I will hand it over to you now.
All right. Well, Matt, thanks for the intro there, and big thanks to Catapult for the platform and the opportunity. You know, as I'm listening to your intro there, it's kind of crazy, this opportunity. I'm very humbled to look at the teams that you guys represent, that you have on your clientele roster. Yeah, just the opportunity to be here and speak to everyone that's listening today, everyone that's watching today. It's just fantastic. And I'm really excited about this. This is a topic that I get really fired up about, and a sport that I really enjoy working with and I've come to have a passion for. So the topic of today is collegiate field hockey, as Matt said. But kind of the lens that we're going to look at this thing is the evolution of coaching, but the evolution of conditioning, right? Our bioenergetics training and everything else around that. And when we talk about the evolution piece of it, it's really more about us as a program, but also myself as a practitioner, where I started and where I've come to, and some of the things we might be looking to in the future. This discussion started a few months ago, back in the spring, whenever we hosted a seminar here at the University of Louisville for Catapult. And I was fortunate to be on a panel with the rest of our health and performance team and our field hockey coaching staff. And following that, Matt and I spoke quite a bit, and we thought it'd be great to kind of provide a little bit more context around what we do as a program, but holistically how we make decisions. So you'll notice that through the talk today, that a lot of this is centered around how we're making decisions as a group and where we've evolved and some of the mistakes we've made in the past and the things that we're moving to now. So, as Matt said, my name is Chad Workman. I'm an assistant director of sports performance here at the University of Louisville. I am in my 4th year, in my return back here. We'll talk about that in a moment. I'm also currently a PhD student here in sports administration in our educational leadership department. Like Matt said, that's my email. You'll see it again later. Feel free to shoot me any questions you have regarding this or anything else. So I got my start back in 2008 at a small school in North Carolina called UNC Greensboro. I got my undergraduate there, did a couple of internships, and following that, I worked there full time for a couple of years. Left UNC Greensboro and actually came here to the University of Louisville, and I was a graduate assistant from 2011 to 2013. And through that, I had the opportunity to work with every single program and some fantastic coaches here. I left here and then went to Virginia Commonwealth University, and I worked there for 2 years with the men's and women's soccer programs. And this is where I really cut my teeth on this concept of conditioning. I was afforded an opportunity to try a lot of new things, make a lot of mistakes, and then learn from those mistakes and able to carry some good products forward. I left VCU and went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Had the great fortune there to work with their field hockey program. And this was my introduction to the sport of field hockey, where I first started working with them. I worked there for 4 years, and that was a great experience working with a really storied program, but also with several other teams there and having the opportunity to work with great athletes, experiment and try some new things and learn from those as well. So after being at North Carolina for 4 years, I came here to the University of Louisville. I've been working with our field hockey program the entire time I've been here for that entire 4 years. Very, very fortunate to be a part of a fantastic staff, fantastic coaching staff, and what you'll see kind of how our processes have evolved in this conversation today. So as I said, had the opportunity to work with some great field hockey programs and been very fortunate to see some success on the field as well. In North Carolina, I was fortunate to be a part of a national championship back in 2018. And then coming here to U of L, we made it to the Final Four back in 2020. So overall, with the programs that I've worked with in field hockey, we've been to the NCAA tournament 8 separate times and the Final Four 5 different times. So as I said, had the opportunity to work with some great teams and some fantastic athletes. Some people in the performance world would say things are easier whenever you work with teams that are a little bit better. And I actually would agree with that. Winning definitely makes things a little bit easier overall. When you have better athletes, it makes things easier too. But for the purposes of this conversation, I think it really helps me to provide clarity for what it takes to win. Before we move forward, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who've made this possible today. Thanks to Catapult. Thanks to my director here, Jason Durking, for allowing me this opportunity, but also for teaching me. He's our resident bioenergetics expert. Big thanks to Greg Gatz and Tim Contos. They're the directors at UNC and VCU, providing me with autonomy to learn and to grow while I was there. A big thanks to Justine Sowery, our head coach for field hockey here at U of L. Runs a fantastic program and has trusted me to do the strength conditioning side of her stuff. So really appreciate that. Karen Shelton taught me a lot about field hockey at North Carolina, but probably the biggest thanks that I want to give today is to Paul Jones and to Matt Donis. They're data analysts here that we have at U of L. They're the boots on the ground, doing the day-to-day live collection, the day-to-day analysis of all of our Catapult information. They've done a lot of reports, done a lot of different special projects, of which I will report quite a bit today and talk to you all about. So without their efforts and without their expertise, I wouldn't be able to have this today. So thanks, guys. So like we said, the topic of the day is the evolution of a practitioner, the evolution of conditioning. So what are the ways that I have evolved and we have evolved as a program? Well, we've really evolved in our approach to our needs analysis and reverse engineering of the sport. And this has really impacted our performance testing and then our decision making that goes around that. But once we have those decisions, right, how are we going to utilize that in real time to develop a program? So that's really impacted our periodization. We've changed over the time and how we're viewing our training sequencing throughout the annual plan. And then ultimately our training methods and our exact program design in terms of the X's and O's of what we're doing. That's evolved quite a bit as well as we've learned more over the years, and we're seeing more and more industry methodology be refined. So what is conditioning? This is from the dictionary. Conditioning is the process of training to become physically fit by a regimen of exercise, diet, and rest. So most of the people that are watching this today probably really interested in what is the process of training, right? Well, the process of training is to become physically fit. But the question that I want to ask now, and I want us to think about moving forward throughout this presentation, is what are we becoming physically fit for? And how is that going to impact what's happening on the field and how we're going to win championships? But why should we care about conditioning? Why is this the topic that we decided to talk about today? Well, one of the things that we see is that endurance performance is correlated to high intensity outputs in competition. This shows up in the literature whenever we look at our endurance test ability, our endurance performance, and we compare that to our high intensity and high speed running that are done in matches. We see this strong positive correlation. And not just in the literature, we've also observed this same phenomena here with our population at U of L. Paul Jones, the data analyst that I mentioned before, did this massive field sport review for all of our field sports here at U of L back in 2019. And what Paul did was he took all of our performance testing data, as well as all of our historical competition data from a Catapult perspective, and then compared the two together. And he came up with a whole lot of cool findings. But for the scope of this talk, one of the things that I'll highlight today is that there was a very clear positive trend of increased duration specific intensity with increased results or increased performance on endurance testing, namely the yo-yo intermittent recovery level 1. But it's not just about being able to have high outputs in the matches, right? It's not just about being able to run around the field like your hair's on fire. How are we utilizing it? And so this is another thing that Paul found, was that teams that consistently had high physical outputs across all of those timeframes or duration specific intensity had greater chances of ending the match with a win or with a tie. So why conditioning? Well, when it's done correctly, these conditioning interventions can be some of the most impactful stimuli that we can give a student athlete. But before we move forward, we need to ask a question of what? What are we actually trying to accomplish with our conditioning, right? Do we just want to be able to run a 4-minute mile? Do we want to get, an 18.5 on the yo-yo IR1? We need to think about, like, what are we actually trying to accomplish? First and foremost, we need to be able to practice effectively to develop the skills and the tactics necessary to outmaneuver our opponent. We need to be able to physically thrive in competition. Can we sustain the work rate necessary to outmaneuver our opponent or to prevent them from outmaneuvering us? And then we also want to utilize our conditioning concepts to help mitigate injury risk and then to maximize our athlete availability. The first evolution we're going to talk about today is our needs analysis and decision making. And historically, when we talk about a needs analysis from a strength and conditioning perspective, we're talking about the physical aspects that we might see in the sport. So what are the endurance demands? What would be the speed demands, the strength, range of motion type things? We might look at some biomechanical considerations, potentially some specific sport movement considerations, and some kinematics and kinetics that could occur within the sport demand. But instead of looking solely at the physical components, I would propose that we start to take this multidisciplinary approach to our needs analysis, bringing in all the stakeholders into the conversation to understand what the holistic demands are on our student athletes. And this is an approach that we've taken here at the University of Louisville. Whenever we get together with our high performance team meetings, and we have those once a week, sometimes once every other week, we'll bring in all these key stakeholders to have discussions on what's going on with the athlete. But to narrow this down for the scope of this discussion today, we can talk about what Dr. Fergus Connolly calls the 4 coactive model in his book, Game Changer. And what this does is it breaks the performance of the athlete down into 4 separate parts: the technical, physical, the psychological, and the tactical. And here at U of L, our field hockey coaches have applied a version of this directly to how they are assessing our student athletes. So at the end of each season and at the end of each off season, what we'll do is we'll look at our athletes one by one, and we'll look at all these key components. We talked about the ones of the 4 coactive model, and these will go out to each of the respective health and performance units. Mine will be the physical component. And what we'll do is we'll assess each athlete relative to those particular areas, right? And so for me, within the physical piece, I'll use our physical benchmarks, like what is our relative strength benchmark? What is our endurance benchmark that we're trying to accomplish as a group? And then what we'll do is we'll scale the athletes on those, and then we'll put together some notes alongside those of things we think they should emphasize. And so we utilize this then as a staff to set goals for the athletes. They'll meet with the student athlete, present these goals to them, but then that scope comes back to whenever we all meet and we say, okay, what are our goals for this offseason? What are our goals for this season? How are we going to change these emphasis, and how does it impact what's going to happen on the field? So this decision doesn't always come down to like, hey, we need to be a little bit stronger. Hey, this person needs to try to get a little bit faster, and it just changes their physical programming. This might come down to decisions like, we have an athlete who meets all of our physical benchmarks, but is lacking in some technical areas on the field. So instead of them doing a conditioning session with us on Thursday, maybe they're going to go out to the field and do a technical session with a coach so that they can shore up that particular area. Continue to discuss our needs analysis. Let's look at some sport output demands. So when we look at our Catapult norms for match play with our starters, we see some interesting relationships. So our positional norms for total distance, high speed, and very high speed, when we look at our midfielders and defenders, they tend to have more total distance than our attackers do. But our attackers are close to midfielders in terms of our intensity metrics. And we continue to look at this from a work rate standpoint, it actually flips and it is inverse. Our attackers do more total and high intensity work per minute than our midfielders and defenders do. And what we've found, and this is in relation to their spell duration, so how long they're on the field for a rotation, and their total time on the field. So as we start looking at specific positional considerations and their demands in the sport, one of the things I want to bring your attention to is the rotation and the rest periods. So just specifically with this conversation, we'll notice that our strikers, our attackers, tend to be on the field for a shorter duration and oftentimes have a longer rest off the field. So what they're going to do is auto-regulate up to higher intensities when they're out there, and thus they're going to have some higher work rates. So how does this affect how we move forward? When we consider the bioenergetic demands of a sport, we often look at things on this continuum of aerobic to anaerobic, right? And so as we consider some of the match norms, maybe we look at our midfielders and defenders, and they're somewhere down this range of this kind of more aerobic end because they're on the field, they're covering more total distance, right? And then we consider our strikers, maybe that's a little bit further down this continuum. So in the past, we may have arrived at this conclusion that our strikers need more anaerobic conditioning relative to our midfielders and defenders. It's a logical conclusion to come to. However, one of the things to think about is this isn't necessarily always going to change how we train our athletes, but it can provide some context for decision making. And I say that because it's not just about competition. This is a clip from a report taken mid-season in 2021. And what we're looking at are the 7-day rolling averages for each of the metrics that we collect. To reiterate my point from before, if we look solely at match metrics to determine our training needs, we might be a little bit misled. At this point in the year, the 3 highest chronic workloads were all from different positions. This means that if we physiologically emphasize our training based solely on competition demands, we might miss the mark a little bit, because if we underload our striker in terms of total volume, because we're solely isolating those anaerobic outputs, we might not prepare them adequately for the volume of work that they will see once they arrive in the season. So we can't have a conversation around collegiate field sport and not address fitness testing. And for those of you who haven't been around collegiate athletics, preseason fitness testing has been this kind of historical rite of passage. It's become its own landmark in the calendar. Unfortunately, this can detract from our big picture focus, which is being successful on the field. Historically, how have we viewed our fitness test? Well, we've had this very binary approach of you either pass the fitness test or you fail the fitness test. And this kind of mentality, I was having a conversation with another coach today, it's ingrained in our athletes, right? Before they even get to campus, they'll say things like, oh, what's the fitness test standard? I want to pass the fitness test, or whatever it might be. Fair enough, I want you guys to come on a campus ready to participate and at a high endurance level, right? But usually with this pass-fail concept, there's going to be some consequences to it, right? So typical consequences might be you have to do extra conditioning, which may be warranted, but also may have some faults to it. Or you might withhold playing time, which can be a real issue if we start talking about certain players within our roster not meeting certain standards. So we see lots of things come out of this particular system, lots of different issues. One of the biggest ones is test anxiety. And I'm not that concerned that they're worried about the test. In fact, it's probably a good thing that our athletes feel a little bit of stress and a little bit of anxiety about performance, right? That's something they've got to get used to be good on the field. But the reality is they get so much anxiety about it that everything becomes about getting ready for their fitness test. So as they're getting ready to come on campus, everything's about getting ready for the test, getting ready for the test. When the reality is we should be more concerned about how we're going to go win a championship, right? And certainly the fitness test is a piece of that. Our endurance performance is a piece of that, but we lose scope because we get so myopically focused. As I mentioned before, we can run into accountability issues. And where this is a problem is if we, for example, we talk about consequences. If we're going to withhold playing time, if you don't make this, then you will not play. If you're unable to create the standard, or if you're unable to make a certain mark, right? So now let's say the best player on our team shows up on campus and can't get to that fitness test standard, right? If you're a coach, are you going to withhold that player off the field? You may, you also may not. You may have to find other ways around it so that that player can now make the field. You might have to change your standard or bend the rules or anything else like that. And then that kind of goes in the face of the whole idea of having a standard in the first place. The biggest issue from my perspective, though, is whenever you put these negative connotations and so much anxiety around endurance testing, endurance training can become a real burden. Our student athletes start to begrudge the process of getting better at our endurance piece. And because of that negative connotation, they don't have an intrinsic value of how much they really want to be better. What I want our student athletes to do is I want them to really value the process of training, really value getting better. And it's not always going to be fun and enjoyable. There's no question about that. Conditioning is tough. However, whenever we can create that intrinsic motivation around it, it's going to help us see consistent improvement across time, which is really what we're after. But ultimately, fitness testing should be used to inform the training process and help the staff with decision making. This is a table that I've pulled together showing endurance test norms for common assessments in collegiate and international women's field hockey. This information is coming from multiple sources, from Dan Baker, from Nathan Heaney, as well as from Dave Hamilton in a book chapter on high-intensity interval training, as well as from our historic information over the last several years here at University of Louisville. There's a few things that I want to talk about that kind of pull away from this particular graph, or excuse me, from this table. The first one is that there is a difference between elite level performance and collegiate performance. Certainly, we want our student athletes to be as successful as they can. We want to challenge them and we want to push them to be the best possible. But we've got to understand that elite is elite for a reason, and not all of our student athletes are going to have the genetic capacity to reach those elite levels. The second one is there will be individuals on your team that have the skills to contribute on the field, but not elite level endurance performance. So if we have a binary system, you may miss out on opportunities for those individuals to contribute on the field. The third is we need to understand what the norms are for our population. And from that, we can get an idea of what is sufficient and what is high performing. Once we get that information, now we can put this into some sort of decision-making process. So if you look at our average yo-yo IR1 scores, so consistently here at the University of Louisville, across most of our preseason testing periods, we're going to see a team average of about 16.2 with a standard deviation of around 8 shuttles. So if you do the math on that, that puts us at a range from about 15.1 to 17.1. That's going to be mathematically around 68% of our population is going to fall in that particular range. So we're going to utilize those ranges to help define our lower limits and our upper limits and how we're going to move forward with our information. But this begs the question, though, this is something our coaches always challenge me on, and rightfully so, then what is our messaging? If we don't necessarily have a standard, what is our messaging for everyone? And what I'm going to tell them is that it's about getting 1% better every day. If you show up on campus and you run a 14.1 on that yo-yo, we have an understanding that is not sufficient for you to succeed at the sport, right? But I'm not going to expect you to run an 18.3 in the next month. That's probably not something that we can see. But what I want you to do is try your hardest to get 1% better every single day. So the next time we do that test again, you might run four shuttles further. And then you continue the process. The next time you're 4 shuttles further. And what we've seen here is by having that messaging, what a lot of our athletes are able to do is see really consistent progress because they're not so beat down with this idea of I'm insufficient. Now we can continue to see some good progress over time, and eventually they're able to get into higher levels of endurance performance relative to themselves. But ultimately now we're starting to see we get individuals reaching up into those higher performance ranges. So this is an example of what we've done with that information here at U of L. Instead of a single standard for our group, we've developed a tier system that helps us with specific training and supplemental conditioning decisions. Note that there are a couple of things that are still present. It's what we call is a performance goal, and we also have a participation minimum. So our performance goal is based off of the field sport review that I showed earlier from Paul Jones. And what he saw and what we found was right in that 16.5 to 17.1 range on that yo-yo. We started to see a little bit of a plateau in our high intensity outputs, that duration specific intensity on the field in competition. So we know once we reach that level, now we're starting to plateau and we're not going to see too much more return on investment for trying to drive that any further. So that's our performance goal. That's where we're trying to get all of our athletes. And that's what's communicated to them. This is our goal. This is where we're trying to get to. I understand that you may not be there yet, but that's how we're going to try to build to it. And alongside that, we have other kind of nomenclature there, as well as some associated scores. And we're going to use some of these training decisions to talk as a staff and come up with what we're going to do moving forward with our athletes. So what we've seen with this particular system is we've had a massive reduction in test anxiety, right? So we're able to bring scope into the things that are truly important, not just our endurance test. We've seen a big increase in student athlete buy-in, right? Because they're not so stressed out about this. They've got a much better relationship with our conditioning process. And even though they may not like it every single day, now they buy into getting better. So with that, we've had an increase in program compliance and ultimately long-term results. So how are we actually utilizing this type of information, right? And full disclosure, we don't just do an endurance test. We've got movement assessments, we've got force plate stuff that's going into this. We have injury history reports, all these things coming in from all of these stakeholders and all of these input variables, right? But we're going to take all of this and talk about how we make decisions, right? So I've got a case study here, and these are 2 individuals of a similar position that arrived at a preseason period just before we started our competition period in the fall. And they had a couple of different scenarios, and we're going to talk about how those scenarios informed how we were going to move forward. So athlete A is a senior defender. They have an above average skill. They're a starter and a key role player on the squad. Their style of play is as a holding defender. Their injury history was relatively insignificant. When we look at their endurance performance testing, we see in their yo-yo IR1 that they were at 15.1, and based upon our tier system before, that would label them as below average. Their chronic training history, so what we'd seen them do over the last 28 days or so, they'd been pretty consistent. We knew they were on campus participating in captain's practices, and we knew that they'd been consistent with team workouts. So we're going to compare this to athlete B. Athlete B is also a senior defender. They're also a starter and a key role player on the team. They are above average skill. Their style is as an attacking defender, so slightly different demands compared to the other player. Their injury history, they recently suffered from a bout of mediotibial stress syndrome. And their endurance performance on the yo-yo IR1 was a 16.2, which we would, based on our tier system, we'd call that average. One thing to note, though, for this particular individual, this was actually a subpar performance. They had historically been in our above average category. Their chronic training history was inconsistent due to the medial tibial stress syndrome. So we have two athletes with a couple of different scenarios here, right? And if we look at this historically and say, okay, well, athlete A, you have a low endurance level. And if we have a binary pass-fail system, you are not allowed to participate. Or you have to do extra conditioning off the sideline instead of playing on the field. But this is a starter and a role player, right? We're going to hold them off and make them do extra running. Athlete B, you fall into a higher category of our conditioning testing, so we're going to let you roll forward and go out in the field. However, you have an inconsistent training history, as well as a recent injury that is based on a acute increase and acute overload and too much work at one time. So what decision do we come up with? Well, actually, we decided we were going to train athlete A as normal. We're going to put them into team participation and let them get after it. And guess what? They wound up being great all season, had no issues. And for athlete B, we were going to give them a limited progression of workload and build them back up while simultaneously giving them some supplemental conditioning off their legs. So not running based, it was biking and other things like that on the sidelines. So when we take these concepts and we look at all these different angles of information coming in, this allows us to make informed decisions as opposed to just using a single binary way of making decisions on how we're going to move forward with our participation. So ultimately, what it allows us to do is to get our best players on the field to participate at a high level and develop them up when we need them to. And it also keeps our best players on the field because we're making smart decisions on our progression of workload. The next section we're going to talk about, we're going to segue a little bit into program design and how we're going about these things. So how have we evolved? How have I evolved as a practitioner when it comes to our long-term training design?
Sorry, Chad, just before we jump into that, I might just ask a quick question, just to obviously, like, if I'm looking at this with as a new user, or like from a Catapult perspective, or if it's a really young coach that is coaching the team for the first time, what would you recommend, like where to start out? If it is testing, obviously that they're looking at, with lack of resources in particular areas, what would you recommend as a starting point for them?
That's a really good question. I think there's a lot of things to dig into with that. So if you're a young practitioner starting with the team, one of the first hurdles to get over is to have conversations with the rest of the performance team, and particularly the sport coaches, right? So we can allude to this a little bit later. Some of the mistakes I've made in the past is I've just come in, here's what we can do. This is the good way to do it, right? Yeah. And then if you don't have the sport coaches on your side, you can wind up getting yourself into some trouble. So ask questions of them. What do they want to see and what do they think is important? But alongside that, it's very important for us to do our own literature review, understand, like, for the sport of field hockey, what are the things that are important, right? And what are some common tests? And I displayed some of them before. What are norms for the population, as I displayed before? So it helps us to understand a little bit better where we should be in relation to the norms of the population, right? So if you're a new user and you come in, you say, okay, we're going to use the yo-yo IR1, and you come in a preseason and everybody on your team is running in that 14, low 15 range, and it's a Division I team, you can understand that you're probably going to be underperforming relative to the higher level Division I program. So that can give you some feedback of like, hey, I should probably figure out a way to get them, get their endurance performance a little bit higher, right? Does that answer the question? I hope it does.
Absolutely. Okay. No, I think it's a really important one, because no doubt there'll be practitioners watching this from all around the world, and just really evaluating where to start, right? And what can they start with, where to go for resources. And I think absolutely you've displayed that right in front of them. And it can be some great feedback for their athletes. So
that's great.
Thank you very much for providing that.
Of course. Yeah, I think the other thing I'd say too is, you've got to do your homework. And at the end of this, there's going to be a huge citations page. So whoever's watching this, just, screenshot that, start peeling apart those different studies, right? And then once you get into that, start looking at their citations. And what that's going to do is just going to send you down this rabbit hole of, what is maximal aerobic speed for field hockey? What is the elite level performance in this? what is sub elite, and then, you know, how am I going to go about doing these things? So yeah, definitely that's where you get your start.
And I think you displayed it really well. Just in terms of it shouldn't be that daunting for a head coach as well. Like looking at the size of your staff to be able to provide the detail that's gone into that. I think for any young coach that that might be trying to feel like they're doing everything by themselves, in terms of what you've displayed, like this should be relatively comfortable for them to roll out. So
for sure. For sure. Yeah, I think the thing that, like, if we're talking to a sport coach on this, the big piece of it would be to just consider multiple angles and aspects of decision making there and how you're going to be successful on the field, right? Because oftentimes coaches want to create a standard. They want their kids to work hard. They want to have a program that's rooted in the tough, hard work. And with that, they'll create, you know, a very lofty expectation, which I actually think is perfectly normal. Like, we should have high expectations there, but we should also keep ourselves kind of honest with what reality actually is going to be, right? Your starting midfielder might come back and be below those expectations. So how are you going to handle that particular situation? So it comes down to, like, your nomenclature around that, the words you're saying and things like that. And these are conversations I'm wide open to. If any sport coaches listening, feel free to call me. You know, you can call me out on it. Yeah, there's holes in that system, no question. I'll tell you this, the tier system, I got called out on it 2 days ago by our coaches here about something they didn't like about it. And we came up with a solution and had some conversations on it. Yeah, so don't get me wrong, there's definitely no perfect solution there. It's just the one that we've arrived at this point based on things we'd seen in the past. And the thing that I like about that kind of tier system most is that it allows us to get our players on the field. And instead of making decisions that are punitive, we make decisions that are supportive. And we say things like, hey, we need you to be fitter on the field. So still participate in this, still participate in this. We're just going to make other decisions and maybe give you something to help support you around that. Yeah,
that's great. Awesome, mate. Appreciate that.
So one of the things we need to talk about before we get in depth into periodization is understanding the limitations that we have in collegiate field hockey. And so for some of the different practitioners that might be watching that aren't familiar with collegiate sport and some of the rules around it, this will be very helpful. But for me, I find it very beneficial to look at constraints before we start program planning. I say that because once we have our constraints in place, it actually will make decisions for us. So when we look at collegiate field hockey, we have 2 competitive periods in the year. We have our primary competitive season in the fall, and that's from August to late November. And then we have another shorter competitive period in our off season that is in the late spring. A couple of really important periods in our calendar to bring up are our winter and our summer breaks. And these are really important for us, really important considerations, because based on NCAA rules, we cannot mandate activity during these periods. So I can't, if you're on my team, I can't say, hey, report to me that you did this workout today. I can't ask them to do that. They also can't have any interactions in sport activity with our coaches. So even if they're on campus, they can't say, hey, coach, I want to go out and play with you tomorrow. Can you show me how to do this? They can't do that. So they're very limited in what we can do in those time periods. So throughout our calendar, it leaves us one chunk of time that is in our early off season from January through March, and they're on campus. We can require activity, but there are limitations to the hours of that. So what we talk about next, or we call these different hours periods. And so you might hear the terminology 20 hours versus 8 hours. And what that means is that's the total number of countable hours that we can demand of a student athlete's time in a single week. And there's a few other rules around it too. So once we understand what our limitations are and we see where the big periods in the calendar where we need to be at our best are, we can start to identify, okay, when do I want to really drive performance and how am I going to succeed at that? So the big ones for me, one of the most important ones obviously is leading right into our primary competitive season, and that is over that summer break. We'll talk about some strategies for that in a moment. But the other one too that's really important for me is this period where we're on campus and we can do some required activity in the early off season. And so through these 2 periods, I'm really driving performance across all of our physical qualities because, and we'll talk about, well, I'll go ahead and move into the next one. I'll get ahead of myself here. So as we talk about training allocations in the off season, what I mean by that is how much time we're spending on developing different physical qualities. Traditional strength and conditioning has kind of taken this strength emphasized linear approach to off season training. And what I mean by that is in the early off season, we spend a lot more time working on our strength development. And then as we progress through the off season, we spend more time working on our conditioning development, right? And the idea of this is rational. It means, okay, we're far away from the sport. Let's develop general qualities that may not be as sport specific. And as we get closer to our competitive period, we'll build up our endurance qualities, right? We see a lot of issues with this approach. So one of the big ones that we see is that right here in this February period, we start our 20 hours. And so what that means for our athletes is they're going to start participating in a lot higher volume of sport participation. If we arrive in that 20-hour period, not having done much running-based conditioning, what we're going to see is that we are going to have low fitness levels as well as low chronic training loads. So now we're going to enter them into this higher volume period of sport participation. And that's going to set them up for potential injury risk and low performance because, as I said before, we have to be physically fit enough to thrive in practice so we can get better. In April, sport will become the primary emphasis for all of our student athletes. Spring competition demands are actually really high. One of the highest ones we see in the year. We might play up to 4 whole matches in a single weekend. So if we arrive at this point where we don't have good endurance performance and we haven't accumulated enough total work volume, what we'll see again is a potential risk of injury, low performance levels, and ultimately set ourselves up for negative outcomes. Then in May, most of our student athletes are going to go off campus. It's likely that they're going to detrain. So if we arrive at this point and haven't developed a high level of endurance performance, we're going to detrain even further from what we would call a relatively low endurance performance, which sets us up poorly for when we return back to campus in July. This is where preparation for our season really begins. So a lot of our student athletes will come back to campus in the month of July. And at this point, if we're already starting at a low fitness level, it's going to be really unlikely that over the next 4 weeks, we're able to reach the optimal levels of performance. So instead of that linear type approach, what I would propose is this vertical integration model where different physical traits are trained to an effective dose simultaneously, but the level of emphasis varies relative to their importance within the timeline. So what we're looking at with this graph are 3 different types of stimuli or activities that our student athletes or field hockey players will go through. So we have sport, we have conditioning, and we have strength development, right? And that's not the only things we do, but it's a simplified model. So what I'm going to do with this is identify periods throughout the calendar where sport is very important and it's become a primary focus of our student athlete. And once I've identified those moments, what I'm going to do is work my way backwards from there, building up the qualities that are going to allow us, 1, to succeed at the highest level during that period, but also 2, to be resilient and robust against injuries. So then this also allows us, once we come back to campus in July, it allows us to return with a high chronic load of running-based conditioning. And so whenever we see this big increase in workload in July when we're getting ready for our preseason, we're already going to be in good shape. And we also have fewer concerns of big spikes in acute to chronic work ratio. So we've talked about our design, our periodization, our annual planning, if you will. So the next thing we're going to talk about now are what are the X's and O's that go into that process. But as part of that, I want to talk about my evolution of a coach because it's really informed where I'm at today. So when I started back in UNC Greensboro, we didn't have a very systematic way of approaching our conditioning development, right? So we might say things like, hey, go out for a run, right? Lower intensity, longer duration. We'd utilize some different anaerobic, some high intensity anaerobic means, like we did a whole bunch of 300-yard shuttles and other things like that. We did quite a bit of GPP or general physical preparation, some sled pushes, and some other different activities and things like that. And not that there's anything inherently wrong with these things. And we still use some stuff like this within our system today. However, we need to systematically put it in place so that we arrive at the end that we want to. Because at this time frame for me, I was really focused on things like, velocity-based training and being within the right ranges. We were utilizing undulating methods of utilizing accommodating resistance within the training week from our strength development, but we didn't have a really systematic way of looking at our conditioning stuff. And then came about the high intensity interval craze, right? Where, if you did anything that lasted more than 20 seconds and wasn't maximal intensity, that, all of your neuromuscular output was just going to melt away like ice cream in the sun. But I arrived here at U of L as a graduate assistant, and I was introduced to this metabolic conditioning framework that was developed by our director, Jason Durking. He pioneered this for our program and was one of the first collegiate coaches that I ever saw utilizing a system of training for conditioning, not just traditional standardized workouts. And what this did was it really inspired me to try and learn more about how we can apply conditioning methods moving forward. So when I started working with men's soccer and women's soccer at VCU, I became really interested in what was maximal aerobic speed. And to my knowledge, back at the time, there weren't that many practitioners. It's pretty commonplace now within the collegiate system. But at that time, I didn't know many people using it. And I started out with just the Dan Baker article on simplyfaster.com. And so if you're new to maximum aerobic speed, I would actually highly suggest going to that article and just cutting your teeth on that. But what I realize now is that as I've progressed over time, really the things that are changing and evolving is that we're seeing increases in individualization and in specificity, right? So before it was everybody go push the sled as hard as you can. So the sled itself is not going to be very specific to running on the field and field hockey. Not that everything always has to be specific, but you hear my point. And individualization, instead of saying everybody push the 50-pound sled as hard as you can, now we're talking about you run 70 meters, I run 80 meters. And more recently, we've started to utilize this concept of anaerobic speed reserve. And we've really utilized this mostly with kind of our faster conditioning methods. But it's essentially a combination of maximal sprint speed and maximal aerobic speed and utilizing that to prescribe running velocities. And it's definitely a more accurate prescription for each individual. But what we've really seen are the same things that some of the other higher level practitioners have reported as well, is that this is really effective at individual prescription for fast individuals who may have low aerobic fitness, or high aerobic individuals that have low maximal sprint speed. So as I've said, really, how are we evolving? How have I evolved as a practitioner over time? We're moving down this continuum of specificity and individualization. And where this has ultimately led to today is this system that you see in front of us. By going through different methods over the years, by making mistakes, and by finding solutions and coming up with new ways to train, we've arrived at this particular bioenergetic training framework that our staff here at U of L uses. So this is going to list all sorts of different methods, ranging from our slower steady state methods to varying speeds of high intensity interval training. But what I want to bring your attention to right here are a couple of methods that I have had a lot of success with our field hockey program here. And that is our long intervals and our short intervals. And the reason why that we've had a lot of success, the reason why we're utilizing them to a high degree, is that long intervals and short intervals are particularly good at increasing markers of aerobic fitness with a relatively short adaptation time. This has been shown through multiple studies. And through this one right here, what Nathan Heaney did, he took a 4-week high intensity interval training program utilizing primarily short intervals for 2 sessions per week with elite level female field hockey players in Australia. And what he found was just in that 4 week of 2 sessions per week. And if you look at the actual report in this, it was a poster that Nathan put together for, I believe it was an ASCA event. But if you look at the workouts that they had in there, they're pretty tough workouts with some pretty high volume. So it's no real surprise that they got some good results. But what you saw at the end of this study, they had an increase in yo-yo IR1 performance of nearly 15%. We also see great results from long intervals as well. So this study displayed the before and after results of a soccer team utilizing a long interval format workout 2 times a week for 8 weeks, in addition to soccer training. And what they saw with this pre and post study were big increases in these physiological endurance markers like VO2 max, lactate threshold, and running economy. But not only that, they also saw big changes in match specific outputs. So total distance in match, as well as the total number of sprints performed in a match. We've talked a bit here about some general conditioning methods, but really where I'm evolving as a practitioner is by asking better questions like, what are we trying to condition to? So it's not just about being able to have higher outputs in the sport. Yes, it can improve our success, but what are we trying to do? Well, ultimately, we're trying to be successful at the sport itself. There's a lot of evidence to support the use of small-sided games in our preparation. We consistently see that small-sided games can be as effective as general conditioning, as well as more enjoyable. And in this study by Duthie et al., they looked at a few different small-sided game formats to find out if the mechanical work was similar to full-sided competition. And what they found was that utilizing small-sided games was effective for us exposing athletes to competition, acceleration, and deceleration demands, but not mean speed. And so what they meant by mean speed was the average velocity of the players moving throughout the small-sided games was not similar to what they saw in full-sided competition. So what we can take away from this, and it's been reported in other studies as well, is that for small-sided games to be an effective tool, the parameters have to be adjusted to require the physical demands that we want to see. And this review paper by Clement et al. Provides some really excellent insight into existing small-sided games research, as well as some practical application suggestions. And so this table is actually adapted from that article and shows some different variables for session design to elicit specific physiological adaptations. So what this can do is can provide some clarity for us on how we can use small-sided games strategically as a conditioning stimulus. So one of the methods that I've actually been pushing quite a bit whenever I have the opportunity to talk to our coaches about how are we going to utilize this to change what we're doing within practice to drive some physical development. Whenever I'm talking to our captains over the summer about captain's practice design, what I'm leaning into are what they're describing in this article is kind of this VO2 max method. And what it actually really looks like whenever you come back to our bioenergetics training methods, it looks a lot like long intervals, right? And so we know that's an effective training method if we can get them up to the intensities necessary. So this is an interesting way of looking at it. And this is kind of the thing that I've been pushing if we get the opportunity to prescribe some small-sided games. But the other thing that we see in small-sided games is that the field size plays a large role in the physical demand, as well as the tactical and the technical focus from the game itself. From a physical standpoint rule, one of the things that I have really been kind of honing in on here is this field player to size ratio. So instead of getting caught up in a lot of these things, because I don't understand the tactics, I don't understand how we're going to maneuver. If I do it this way, then this is going to happen and whatever else. So whenever I'm talking to coaches and I'm trying to help student athletes come up with effective ways with small-sided games, what I'm going to do is just take the number of players that we have relative to the normal pitch size number of players, do a little math and come up with that ratio, and then just use that to say, okay, yeah, okay, you're going to play 5v5 today. Well, then you need to do it in a 33 by 48 size space. And something that I've been turned on to in recent years is the use of technical sport drills as a method of conditioning, particularly for return to play cases. Another thing that I should note in terms of limitations for myself, as a strength conditioning coach working with the team, I can't necessarily utilize sport-specific drills with an athlete for general conditioning. So I can't say, okay, healthy athlete, come over here. We're going to utilize, I'm going to hold a hockey stick and I'm going to hit you a ball while you run across the field and you're going to collect it and pass it into the goal. I can't necessarily do those things based on some NCAA rules. But when it comes to return to play cases, some things are a little bit more gray. And so what we'll do there is utilize our sport coaches as well as our sports medicine staff and myself where it's permissible to put together some different drills to help shore up some gaps. And so what we actually see by utilizing drills like this in the return to play scenarios, this is a really good way to close the gap between rehab, strength conditioning to return, and then sport itself. So right here, this picture is actually an example of a picture that I asked, something that I asked for one of our assistant coaches just yesterday. So we've got an individual on the team who unfortunately is relatively healthy, but can't participate in contact play right now. So during those portions of practice, they're off to the side. So instead of just standing over there and kind of hitting a ball against a board or just running up and down the field in straight lines, one of the things that we decided was, okay, so how can we get them game ready and also keep them engaged and help shore up some technical skills while they can't complete sport participation with the rest of the team. And so they drew up this this particular drill. And so we were able to build this out, think about some parameters in terms of execution speed, work to rest ratios, and things like that that made sense. And we had an effective conditioning workout that had the individual participating in the sport engaged with technical skills. And now they were able to get a little bit closer to competition. So we asked the question of, okay, why do we actually need sport-specific conditioning? Why are we concerned about this whenever the general conditioning, we know that that stuff works, right? But one of the major reasons why we're starting to include this is that we see what we're calling this acceleration load gap. And what acceleration load is just kind of the summation of all the deceleration, acceleration, and positional change moments that occur during sport participation or during whatever activity you're doing. So what we're calling this load gap right here is whenever we transition from primarily general exercise to sport participation, we see this big increase in the total number of those deceleration and acceleration load moments, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because when we think about it, just running in a straight line does not meet the demands of the constant deceleration, body position, and acceleration, right? So we talk about evolutions. One of the things that I saw with this and why did we actually care? So we talk about the acute to chronic work ratio and try not to have big spikes in volume, right? So we were doing a really good job at controlling our high speed and our very high speed and our total volume to make sure that we weren't seeing these massive spikes in our ACWR. But then when we look at something that is actually pretty impactful, which is the amount of decelerations and things that an athlete's going through, we were falling pretty short on that. So we decided we wanted to try to come up with some solutions. So some of the solutions that we came up with, and this is just an application through some of our general conditioning methods, right? So we call this first one some varied short intervals. So we take our short interval method that was already in our bioenergetics framework, and we just apply some different shapes to it that are going to require more frequent change of direction, more different type pattern and maneuverability within the running, and we see an increase in the acceleration load demand. And another one that I really like is what we've called this agility circuit with some repeat acceleration work in there as well. And I actually first saw this concept from the guys over at Elon University. And I believe they may have called it extensive change of direction or something along those lines. So, you know, props to them for coming up with this thing. So what it is essentially a series of different shapes that an athlete has to go through with different change of direction methods. And we're going to utilize some different testing results and physiological ranges to prescribe times to complete each one. But this was really cool because actually we ran this session in our indoor space and immediately followed that up with some small-sided games within practice. And what we saw was that comparing the two together, their acceleration load per minute was actually pretty similar between this agility circuit and comparing it to our small-sided sport participation games. And another solution we came up to this actually was small-sided games done in a non-specific way. So for example, we can't, like I said, I can't prescribe our team. Like they can't show up to me and I'm saying, okay, go outside and play 5v5 for, 6 sets of 4 minutes. I can't necessarily tell them that. But what we could do is instead of using a stick and a ball, we might use a different implement. And we play a small-sided handball game. And so Paul Jones actually utilized this with one of our other programs and did this interesting comparison. So he put together this kind of transition style handball game where it was like if one team scores, that team's the other team's off and the other team's automatically in transition. Defense is coming in trying to stop them and whatever else. So he put together this particular style of handball drill, but then he looked at the duration specific intensities and then compared it to competition demands for ACC. I believe this was women's soccer. What he found was there was actually a pretty close level of duration specific intensity across all those different time spans. So could conclude from this, maybe concludes a strong word, but we could take away from this that we could utilize some of those small-sided handball games as a potential surrogate whenever we can't utilize sport-specific small-sided games for physical development. All right, the last section for today is we're going to talk about now building a program. So periodization, we put it together. We've got our methods in place. What are the ones we're going to use? So how are we going to decide to put this together in a program? And so what I'll say is what we always want to do is we start at the end and then work our way backwards, right? So what we do is we look at our key point in the calendar, which is sport participation or sport-specific fitness. We try to understand what are the physical qualities necessary for us to succeed at sport at that point. Then we work our way backwards and individually develop those particular qualities. Then with that in mind, we work our way backwards further and think about how we're going to develop qualities to support those qualities. So what I've done here is actually taken our entire annual plan, and I've laid it out, and we're going to discuss how utilizing that working our way backwards method kind of fills in the gaps here. So what I want you to do is look at the end of this particular timeline right above August, where that's going to be our competitive period, right? And we're going to work our way backwards from here. So coming backwards from that, what are we going to do to prepare for competition? Well, we're going to start utilizing more specific conditioning methods so that we're prepared once we have to take the field in August. Working our way backward from there, we're going to use more general conditioning methods to help prepare for those specific conditioning methods. And as we take a step back from that period, we actually are going to be moving into our spring competitive period, which would be specific methods of training. And then as we take a step back from there, we're going to be in our early off season. That period that I labeled before was really important for physical development. And that's where we're going to utilize some more general training methods. So early off season, winter break, our athletes are off campus. What we're actually going to prescribe at this point are some more steady state aerobic type methods, as well as our tempo runs. And this kind of is a throwback to Steve Magnus. And he has this concept that he calls the funnel method. And what you do is you think about what is the actual demand of the sport, and then you work back to the opposite ends of the continuum of intensity, and then you work your way forward and get them closer together there. So we're going to start with back here at this funnel, the very peak of the funnel, with some slower, longer duration work, and some of our fastest work with longer recovery periods. We progress from there. Once we're on campus for that 8-hour period in the early off season, I'm going to really emphasize some long intervals and short intervals. And like I've said, these are some of our most bang for our buck types of training that we can do and really get multiple types of fitness out of, both aerobic and anaerobic. We've seen some great results with our yo-yo IR1 scores pre to post testing through this period. So once we've gone through that early off-season period, now we're going to move into our spring competition. And what's going to be the main focus at this point? Small-sided and full-sided games. They're playing every day on the field in practice, and then we have competitions on the weekend, right? This is going to be the bulk of what their conditioning efforts are. I may not have a whole lot of other interventions aside from discussions with the coaches on what practice design might look like. And if we do anything at this point, it might be some top-up stuff in low-volume weeks or non-competitive weeks or something like that, where we might push some short intervals just to do some things that they may not experience in practice. So moving into our summer break when we're off campus, we're not playing a whole lot of sport. So what I'm actually going to do is start prescribing some of the highest volume of general conditioning that I will throughout the entire calendar year, mainly because we still have to get ready for our competitive period, but they don't have a lot of sport participation going on. So what I'm going to do is utilize some of our most bang for our buck methods, but then also use some steady state aerobic work so that we are accumulating enough total volume that we're not going to have a big spike in ACWR once they return to campus in July. So speaking of that period, that July return to campus, at this point, we're coming on, we're trying to do some specific preparation. We're going to utilize things like small-sided games. And this might take the form of me having conversations with our captains whenever they go out for captain's practice and say, hey, okay, so how do we want to design practice today? All right, well, we've got 15 players on campus. Great. Well, we're going to go, 3 teams of 5. We're going to go 3-minute rounds, and you're going to cycle around 2 teams on, 1 team off. And we're going to work within this particular time range and build our volume out like so. We also might at this point, if we don't have the capacity to do it through small-sided games, this would be where we would throw in some handball just to make sure that we are shoring up some of that acceleration load. Repeat sprint training also happens to be pretty reflective of some of the highest intensity moments in the sport where we have multiple transitions. We'll usually use this kind of in a shuttle format or in kind of a change of direction type drill or reactive type drill. And then I'm also at this point probably going to start throwing in some varied short intervals, again, to help shore up that acceleration load gap. Let's talk about evolution. ACWR has been one of the most influential concepts to me as a conditioning coach. What it's done is provide kind of this large scale structure concept from how I'm building out my program day to day and week to week. So instead of just taking the methods and saying, all right, well, what's a good volume for this method? It's 6 sets of 2. Or what's a good volume for this method? It's 4 sets of 8. Instead of doing that, now I can consider the total volumes from day to day and week to week. So I want to talk a little bit about how we develop our weekly loading considerations. So much like all the other concepts that I've talked about today, we're going to start at the end and work our way backwards. So we want to identify what period throughout the year that we're preparing for and what does that period look like. And this is the great thing about the technology that we have here is that we can measure what a preseason load usually looks like. And for us, that's around 41 kilometers per week. So that's what I know I need to prepare for. And so we're just going to talk about total volume for the sake of this particular example. So what I'm going to do is work my way backwards and consider how much do I need to do to get ready for this? Well, I'm going to target increases lower than 30% of total volume for each particular week. And we do that because once we go above that 30%, we see big spikes in the ACWR for sure, but those increases in weekly loading usually lead to some overtraining or injury risk. So whenever I do the math on that, what does that give me? It's 29 kilometers, right? And so we'll use that same process, working our way backwards from there and step staging our way up, trying to stabilize and adapt from each phase to phase. So, but as I'm going along the way, one of the other things that I'm considering within my weekly training design is how are we going to manage acute to chronic work ratio? We don't necessarily always want to hold our athletes down, though. We're really going to try to push this, right? I want to push them to get to higher levels. We're going to have to attain that total volume. So what we're going to try to do is try to get them to those ACWR levels above 1.5 or more. If you're familiar with the ACWR, you'll recall that range of 0.8 to 1.4 is kind of that like sweet spot-ish area. And once we get up to that 1.4 plus, we start flagging our athletes for potential injury risks or things like that. But I actually was fortunate to attend a seminar where Gabbett was presenting on ACWR. And one of the things that he talked about within that particular presentation was that if you're trying to develop physical qualities in an athlete and you're never going above 1.5, you're probably not going to make much progress. So I really took that to heart. And now it's basically meaning it's not just about holding people back. It's about training harder and plug for him and smarter as you go through that process. So this is just an example of how we put together an off-season training week. And this is an exact example of what we actually did this past summer in preparation for our season. And so what you'll see here, you can look at the details if you'd like, but what you'll see is that there is a change from day to day in the total volume accumulated, as well as the intensity of the methods that we're utilizing and making sure that those are stacked on top of each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what is my total weekly volume that I'm trying to accumulate this week. And then I'm going to figure out from that point, how much do I need to fit into each day to make sure I'm still falling within the appropriate ACWR loading scheme. And then I'm going to put together the workouts. Okay, so I want to get 7K on Thursday. Okay, well, we probably need to work on some long intervals to accumulate that volume. And I also know they're going to do a captain's practice this day. But because I know I'm going to get after one of those long intervals, we probably need to focus on a technical session. So the next day I might utilize some small-sided games. And because we're really going to push those small-sided games and get after on those, I might pull back on my conditioning efforts and do something that's shorter total distance, but higher intensity in nature. And then utilizing some other methods as well, like the aerobic threshold type run, just to complete the total volume picture and round out the bioenergetic profile, if you will. If you're interested in all these methods and these type of things, I really suggest looking at these resources. These books have been very impactful for me, particularly this the high intensity interval training by Paul Larson and Martin Buchheit. It's a fantastic resource, and actually a lot of the stuff we talked about today just came directly from their concepts that they've developed. The theme of today was evolution. So kind of wrapping it all up, how have I evolved as a practitioner? Well, from a needs analysis standpoint, we've moved from this physical emphasis kind of perspective into a multidisciplinary approach. From our testing, we've moved from this binary system, moving more towards a tier system that allows us to make more holistic decisions. From a periodization concept, we've moved away from isolating and polarizing our emphasis and our allocation of training time to a little bit more of a vertical integration model. And for our methods of training, we're moving from general and trying to get more specific over time. So the next idea that Matt presented to me was, what's next for us then? Well, something we've been talking about on campus for a while now is trying to get better insights into what the metrics look like when compared with the actual situational demand on the sport. So something that I think is really cool is how we can combine video with our data. And before I even knew that Catapult was coming out with this particular product, we had been having some conversations before about, man, wouldn't it be cool if like you could see like when they ran the fastest and when those allocations occur, when did this thing happen the most? What are the moments when we score? What are the loading around the moments we score or we get scored on, or things like that. And I think this can be really insightful, not just for us, but particularly for our coaches and how they are making decisions and then understanding the role of our physical development relative to the sport. As I mentioned before, there's a ton of work that's gone into this that's not my own. So credit to all these individuals for their efforts in the field and for furthering our knowledge. So yeah, if you're really interested in this stuff, if you want to dig deeper, this is a great place to start pulling these things out, start looking at these articles, follow their citations as well. So thanks to everyone who's watching today. Thank you, Matt, for the opportunity to be here. It's been a fantastic talk. And like I said, I get super fired up about this. So if you want to reach out to me, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm really not that active on social media, but yeah, go ahead and connect with me there if you'd like as well.
Awesome, Chad. Mate, thank you so much for that. There's so many takeaways, I think, in it. And I might just share this slide here if anyone obviously has any questions. Again, they can just go to the QR code there and fire away. But yeah, mate, thanks again. So much detail, so much takeaway. And again, I go back to that conversation we had a few months ago, just purely based on the information in the industry and the accessibility to it. I think for any practitioner or coach that's obviously out there and has the opportunity to listen to this presentation, it's going to certainly be a go-to. And I think the resources and the information that you've obviously shared with us today is exactly what I'm being asked in my role with the multiple practitioners that I obviously am fortunate to deal with. And I really do commend you, and obviously on behalf of the university for sharing that, and obviously the coaches' input as well. So again, thanks very much, mate.
Of course.
So, and I think obviously on reflection, again, you mentioned so many different takeaways. Probably one of the questions I had was like just the evolution of your staff, because in as you know, in our roles and multiple environments that we are exposed to, some of those are obviously quite extensive, and some of those are quite granular in terms of where they're starting out.
Right.
Really, how have you seen the evolution, obviously in field hockey with your staff, whether it's at University of Louisville and so forth? What do you feel are the big rocks, or even for where your staff list is at the moment? Do you feel like you have enough? I'm sure this is a question that in reflection, some environments are thinking, where is our detail at? Because this is very high level in terms of the detail and the planning that is no doubt going on. How long did it take to get there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It took a long time, and I will say one of the things you talk about being lucky and fortunate, here at U of L, I work with 3 different sports. So I work with the field hockey, our men's soccer program, as well as our men's tennis program. And so only having 3 teams, and there's some other people on our staff that have fewer than 3, it really allows us a lot more time to be present with the team, not just to do things with them, but to be present with them, to gain trust and buy-in from the athletes and the coaches. So that's where we're really fortunate with that. So, I mean, you obviously have an uphill battle if you're at a smaller program or you don't have as many coaches, right? It's not as easy as that, especially if you're a field hockey coach and you have one strength coach who works with 8 other sports. Bear with them, because it's really hard to get that level of detail into it. But definitely it's taken some time. It's taken a lot of exposure to the sport, to the coaches. I think one of the things that I constantly come back to that is really helpful is to just be present, right? Being present at the practice, being present at the matches, that's going to go a long way in your understanding of the sport, but also the buy-in and the trust from the coaching staff. And then I truly got interested in it. I was like, hey, so what are you doing there? So I'm trying to understand the tactics of the sport, right? And so by asking those questions and by going up to a coach and saying, hey, this person's over on the sideline, I could just have them run up and down, but do you think there's something more productive for their time that they could do that's relative to their sport? And then they might go, well, yeah, true. And I'm like, okay, so help me put together a drill that also comes up with some fitness stuff. Like that amount of, like, just those questions, right? So the willingness to ask those questions and to go there is definitely big. If you're working on a smaller staff, I feel you. I've been worked at VCU. We had 3 coaches. At UNC Greensboro, we had 2. So I know what that battle is like. One of the things that I would encourage you to do in those cases would be think about the context of your sport and where you have more time to do something different than the weight room, get outside of the weight room. Because, if you look at it, let's say you're working with a field hockey program at a school that only has, a couple of strength coaches, you might be spending a lot of time in the weight room because that's where you are. That's what you have time to do. But maybe you take one of those 3 weight sessions and you go out to the field. And you can simply implement some of the stuff that I talked about today. A lot of it, once you understand it, is really easy to roll with. And that could be a great starting point where, again, understanding, like I was kind of trying to display here, that endurance performance is really important. And I think strength development is obviously really important as well. But, sometimes practitioners can get caught up in like, oh, we got to get strong. I agree. But at the same time, how much of an impact is that going to show up on game day,
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. And I think obviously the way you've displayed that and debunked the sport itself, like there is some great takeaways there that is going to hit multiple departments, right? Like you spoke about the medical department and the reintegration for a return to play athlete. And obviously credit to you and Paul, like the amount of detail that he's been able to look at with such a simple game. That is giving us a lot of, obviously, bang for buck to be able to come back into the program and that gap. I think that was such an interesting point to go over again, and everyone should be really reflecting on that particular piece of information that was presented. So, yeah, credit to, obviously, Paul for the amount of analysis that's gone into that as well.
Sure.
In terms of, I suppose, just for a coach that's looking to plan and utilising that communication aspect, if their staff is really small, what are some basic tools that outside of just pen and paper that you would probably recommend as a starting point?
All right. So, are you talking specifically from technology standpoint or just from what we're doing day to day?
Yeah, just day to day, like planning, going into the detail of like a session plan and evolving that out.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, it's actually interesting you bring this up. When I talk with sport coaches, something that's really hard to get out of a sport coach is like, what is your emphasis of this session? What are you trying to get out of this session, right? Because if you're talking to a practitioner, if you're talking to me, I'm going to look at you and say, what is the goal today? Because let's say you do have all this stuff. And this is something that, maybe you step into a role like mine where you do have a lot of resources and you're working with, 1 or 2 teams, you're working with a field hockey program and you say, well, what do I do? You want to ask the coach, what is the purpose? What is the goal here? And it's funny that coaches struggle to come up with that. So really understand your tactical purpose, because then with that, you can work on physical design around it, right? So that will help you once you've got that real understanding as a group, is what am I trying to accomplish today? In terms of the weekly preparation, some rules of thumb that I think would just go into play is definitely understanding that if sport participation is not manipulated, you will not reach the physical demands required for the development that you want. So we can definitely get there through sport practice. It will definitely enhance our fitness levels. But if you don't do it the right way, you'll actually see some detraining over time. I cut out a few slides, and one of them was what you actually see across some sports is fitness assessments throughout the season. By the end of the season, we've actually detrained a general fitness from where we started at the beginning of the season. And I've seen that same thing as well, even with our population here with our field hockey program. Our postseason fitness test scores usually aren't as good as our preseason ones. And a lot of times I think that's because we don't necessarily have the adequate stimulus through sport only participation, because it's tactically oriented, right? Got it. So understand your purpose, understand what's going to happen there. And then, talking to another sport coach, some tools. I think a method of measuring volume and intensity is really good. I mean, that's it. However you go about that, obviously have the resources for a great product like Catapult is fantastic. If not, there's some other things like session RPE. If you don't know what session RPE is, go Google it and then start learning about it. You can utilize it. It's been validated. It can be reliable if you do it the right way. So session RPE can be a free, effective method. It takes some work, but then again, so does utilizing a wearable technology. You're going to have to do some work on the front and back end of that. So
yeah, no doubt. And I suppose just in terms of the frequency of that, like at a high level, you just provide some insight in terms of how frequently you're meeting and what that high performance discussion essentially does look like for anyone that is interested to see what the formula can go. For
sure. Yeah. So now that you're saying that, I think I would add to the toolbox, if you will, get your staff in the meetings and pull the other people into that on a weekly basis and start talking about what you're doing. What are we trying to accomplish? What are the goals of this week? Was it effective? What are we doing moving forward to try and be effective on the next time? And it's not just a calendar overview. It winds up being a pretty good session. We will meet on a weekly basis, just as a holistic staff. And this meeting is growing. And I think right now we've got sports science, data analytics, sports nutrition, mental performance, administration, academics, director of operations, sports staff. Did I say sports medicine? I may not have. We've got all these people represented in this meeting. It can be overwhelming at times, so we have a pretty good structure of how we go about it. And it also sparks some good conversation and debate as well. So we do that weekly with our field hockey program. If not weekly, then I would suggest, when I was at North Carolina, we did it bi-weekly, every other week. And then we would essentially just kind of, what have we been doing? What was effective? What are we doing in the future? And what are the current state of things, where you start having conversations around the players, the individuals, what's going into this. But not just the meetings. Actually, as I said before, I think like a consistent presence is really important. And so for me, I will wind up talking with our coaches on a near daily basis. I mean, I'm really invested, really interested in our program and how we're going to do and how we are doing. I ask questions about like what's happening on the road. Are the recovery methods working out? How did we play today? How did this person look because they were sluggish in the week? What are your thoughts on our physical levels right now? Are we looking tired? Are we looking good? What's our recovery method for the next day looking like? What are our low minute players doing? Those kind of things. These are just text messages that might happen when the team's away. But when we're on campus, I'm seeing them daily. I'm very fortunate. And I point out this window, the field hockey field is 20 feet away. So I'm lucky with that. But I can have consistent eyes on the team, as well as dialogue with the coaches. What's going on today? What are we doing with this? And watch the team perform. So now I can see the things. And once you start to understand the technical and tactical demands, it's really easy for me to see things like, hey, so-and-so is really not that great at trapping the ball. They're struggling on the backhand a lot. They're not really good at receiving on the move or passing on the move. We also see things like the psychological aspects of it. Whenever they do poorly in practice, like you miss a couple of passes and then all of a sudden you're really down on yourself and you're not trying very hard, right? So all these things will be informed as we even talk about it in the meetings too.
Yeah, got it. No, that's some amazing insights, and I think it's it can be a little bit overwhelming, and just to see that evolution for staff, obviously to see the amount of detail with multiple departments that's happening. And as you said, it can be challenging at times, but it's for the better of the program. So it's absolutely amazing, I think, for people that are listening to hear that and actually get some insights into towards what a high performance environment can look like and is happening as we speak. So full credit to you guys.
Well, I would definitely throw some props out to all of our directors of our individual departments, particularly saying some shout out to Dr. Pat Ivy, who has come on here as our director of health and performance. Yeah, I believe that's his title.
Yep.
And so with that, like, he spearheaded this effort, and we're trying to make this the standard across all of our programs too, of all these individual meetings, this high level communication, trying to standardize how we're having those communications as well. So, I mean, it's a very cool time here at U of L with what we're able to do with our department.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, we'll finish up there, but taking up plenty of your time. And again, just to hear those insights for anyone listening, this is certainly why we did it. And this is why we targeted Chad. And this is at a very high level, but I think some clear takeaways, obviously, that have been presented, but don't be overwhelmed. Please feel free to get in touch with him. He's one thing I've found, he's extremely open and he's so passionate about this area. So again, on behalf of everyone here at Catapult, thanks again for coming on, mate. And we'll look forward to the next one.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.